there is a name that has echoed through the corridors of maritime history for nearly 5 centuries. A name that, depending on where you stood in the 16th century world, inspired either celebration or cold, quiet dread. Francis Drake. To the English, he was a hero, a knight, a man touched by God's own wind, who circled the entire known globe and came home bearing Spanish gold and the favor of a queen. To the Spanish, he was something else entirely. They called him El Drac, and they whispered it, the way one whispers about a storm already on the horizon. To the Spanish crown, he was a pirate, a thief, a corsair without conscience who raided their ports, burned their ships, and vanished back into the sea before retribution could find him. The truth, as it so often is, rested somewhere between those two portraits. And that space between them, that shadow between crown and chaos, is exactly where Francis Drake lived his entire life. He was born into obscurity somewhere around 1540 in the county of Devon in the southwest of England. The exact date is lost to us, as so many things from that era are, swallowed by time and the imperfect record-keeping of a world that did not yet know it was producing a legend. His father, Edmund Drake, was a Protestant lay reader, a man of modest means and deep faith, who raised his son in an England still trembling through the aftershocks of the Reformation. It was a world in motion, a world rewriting its own rules, and young Francis Drake would spend his life learning, in the most literal sense possible, to move with it. The sea found him early. As a boy, he was apprenticed to a merchant who worked the coastal trade routes along the English Channel. Small vessels, short crossings, the unglamorous work of moving goods from one grey harbour to another. But Drake was watching. He was always watching. He absorbed the language of tides and winds and wooden hulls, the way other boys absorbed scripture or Latin. And by the time he was a young man, he had already begun to understand something that very few people in his century fully grasped, that the ocean was not merely a barrier between places. It was a road. And the person who knew that road best would hold enormous power. His entry into the wider world of maritime ambition came through his connection to the Hawkins family, one of Plymouth's most powerful seafaring dynasties. John Hawkins, his older cousin, was already deeply involved in the slave trade and the dangerous, profitable business of carrying goods into Spanish colonial waters that Spain considered exclusively their own, by papal decree and by force of arms. Drake sailed on several of Hawkins' expeditions, gaining experience with every crossing, and in 1568, everything changed. At a place called San Juan de Ulua, off the coast of what is now Mexico, a Spanish fleet fell upon the English expedition with devastating force. It was a betrayal, a truce broken, an attack made under the pretense of peace. Most of the English ships were destroyed or captured. Drake barely escaped with his life. And in that moment of fire and smoke and treachery, something crystallized within him. A purpose, a fury, a cold, deliberate intention that would shape the rest of his days. He would make the Spanish pay. What followed was a career of extraordinary audacity. Drake began raiding Spanish settlements along the Caribbean coast, striking fast and disappearing faster. He was not reckless. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. He was calculating, patient, and gifted with a kind of strategic imagination that made him genuinely dangerous. He gathered intelligence. He cultivated allies among the Cimarrons, escaped African slaves who had built their own communities in the interior of Panama, and who had their own profound reasons to despise the Spanish colonial machine. He planned. In 1572, he gazed upon the Pacific Ocean from a treetop in Panama, reportedly the first Englishman ever to see it, and he made a silent vow to himself. One day, he told his men quietly, he would sail an English ship upon those waters. He was not a man who made promises lightly. The vessel that would carry his greatest chapter was called the Pelican, later renamed the Golden Hind, a relatively modest galleon of around 100 tons, crewed by fewer than 200 men. In 1577, under secret commission from Queen Elizabeth I herself, Drake set sail southward. The Queen needed plausible deniability. She needed Spanish gold. She needed a man who asked no uncomfortable questions and feared no impossible odds. She found all three things in Francis Drake. What he accomplished over the next 3 years would stun the world and rewrite the map of English ambition, a circumnavigation of the entire globe, only the second ever completed in the history of human seafaring, carried out with a privateer's cunning and a commander's iron nerve. The Spanish called him a pirate. Elizabeth called him her privateer, bound by letters of marque that made his plunder technically legal, at least from where London was standing. The line between the two has always been thin, drawn not by morality but by whichever nation held the pen. This is his story, and it is one worth telling slowly. There is something worth pausing on before we follow Francis Drake into the chaos of his early raids, before we trace the smoke rising from Spanish harbors and listen to the distant crack of cannon fire rolling across Caribbean water. There is something worth understanding about the world he was stepping into, because without that understanding, Drake can too easily become a simple figure, a swashbuckler, a cartoon of a man with a sword and a smirk. He was nothing of the sort. The Caribbean in the latter half of the 16th century was not merely a geographic region, it was an argument, a vast, sunlit, deadly argument about who owned the world and who had the right to say so. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas had effectively divided the entire non-European world between Spain and Portugal, a line drawn down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by papal authority, splitting the earth like an orange between two hungry hands. Spain took the west, Portugal took the east, and every other nation on earth, England included, was simply told to stay out. The Spanish had taken this arrangement seriously. For nearly a century they had been building an empire in the Americas of staggering scale and wealth, extracting silver from the mines of Peru and Bolivia, loading it onto galleons, and sailing it back to Europe in vast treasure fleets that crossed the Atlantic like slow, magnificent targets. The port cities of the Caribbean coast, Nombre de Dios, Cartagena, Veracruz, were the arteries of this system, pulsing with silver and silk and the labor of enslaved people, guarded by stone forts and Spanish soldiers, and the general assumption that no one would dare. Francis Drake dared. Consistently, methodically, and with considerable imagination. His first significant independent command came in 1572, when he sailed west from Plymouth with 2 small vessels, the Pasco and the Swan, and a crew of just over 70 men. By the standards of any formal naval operation, this was a modest enterprise. By the standards of what Drake intended to accomplish with it, it was extraordinary in its ambition. He was heading for the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow strip of land connecting North and South America, across which Spain transported the bulk of its Peruvian silver overland before loading it onto Atlantic-bound ships. He intended to intercept it. He did not manage it that first time. The raid on Nombre de Dios, the port at the Atlantic end of the silver route, was audacious, almost to the point of folly. Drake led a night assault on the sleeping town with a small force, drums beating and trumpets sounding to make their numbers seem larger than they were. They reached the treasure house at the center of the town. They were, by some accounts, standing within arm's reach of more silver than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. And then Drake collapsed. He had been wounded earlier in the raid, a musket ball to the leg, and had said nothing, pressing forward through sheer determination until his body finally refused the arrangement. His men, unwilling to leave him, carried him back to the ships. The silver stayed where it was. Another man might have taken that as a sign. Drake took it as information. He withdrew, regrouped, and spent the following months operating along the Caribbean coast with the patience of someone who understood that the opportunity would come again if he simply remained in position. He raided smaller targets. He gathered intelligence. He made contact with the Cimarrons, the communities of escaped enslaved Africans who had built free settlements deep in the Panamanian interior and who possessed something Drake needed desperately: knowledge of the land. The relationship between Drake and the Cimarrons is one of the more remarkable and complicated chapters of this entire story, and it deserves its moment of careful attention. These were men and women who had survived the full brutality of the Spanish colonial system, who had escaped it, organized against it, and were now living proof that the empire was not as impenetrable as it liked to appear. Their leader, a man the English sources called Diego, became one of Drake's most trusted guides and companions. The Cimarrons knew every path through the Panamanian jungle, every ford, every hidden approach to the roads the Spanish used to carry their silver. They had reasons of their own to want those roads disrupted. The alliance was practical, but it was also something more than that. Drake ate with these men, fought alongside them, trusted his life to their knowledge, and by the standards of an era in which English adventurers routinely treated non-European peoples as little more than scenery, that meant something. It was with Cimarron guides leading the way that Drake climbed to the peak of a ridge in the jungle interior of Panama in early 1573, looked southward through a gap in the trees, and saw, for the first time in his life, and the first time any English eyes had ever confirmed it, the broad, glittering blue of the Pacific Ocean stretching away to the horizon. He knelt, he prayed, and then, according to the account preserved by his chaplain, he stood back up and declared that he hoped to sail an English ship upon that sea before he died. He was not speaking idly. The opportunity for which he had spent the better part of a year waiting came in the spring of 1573, and when it came through an unexpected collaboration. A French privateer named Guillaume Le Testu had arrived in the region with his own ships and his own appetite for Spanish silver, and the two captains, one English, one French, and both operating in the grey legal space between privateering and outright piracy, joined forces. Together, their combined crews ambushed a mule train carrying Peruvian silver across the Isthmus of Panama. It was one of the most audacious robberies of the entire century. The haul was vast, so vast in fact that they could not carry all of it. They buried a portion in the jungle, intending to return, and took what they could back to the coast. Drake arrived home in Plymouth in August of 1573, slipping quietly into port on a Sunday morning while the townspeople were at church. The story goes that word of his return spread through the congregation before the service was finished, and the pews emptied as people came running to the harbor to see what he had brought back. Whether or not that particular detail is precisely true, it captures something real about the moment. Drake had gone out as a capable and daring captain. He came back as something approaching a legend, but legends, in the 16th century, were complicated things to be. And the years that followed his return were not, on the surface, especially triumphant. The political situation between England and Spain had shifted during his absence. Queen Elizabeth, ever the pragmatic diplomat, was engaged in one of her periodic attempts to manage relations with the Spanish crown, a delicate balancing act she performed throughout her reign, maintaining tension without allowing it to tip into open war. Open acknowledgement of Drake's raids would have been diplomatically inconvenient, and so he found himself in a curious position, celebrated quietly, rewarded privately, but unable to operate openly in English waters. For several years he served in Ireland, fighting in the brutal campaigns there, accumulating military experience of an entirely different kind, and waiting. He was always waiting. That quality, the capacity to hold still, to absorb time without being defeated by it, was perhaps the least dramatic and most essential element of his character. Lesser men spent those years. Drake invested them. By the mid-1570s, the political winds had shifted again. Spain's behavior in the Netherlands, where the Duke of Alba was conducting a campaign of repression against Protestant populations that was making the English crown deeply uncomfortable, had cooled Elizabeth's appetite for diplomatic courtesy. The Queen began to look again at the question of how England might injure Spain without formally declaring war. And in that question, Drake heard his name being called. What was proposed, what was whispered in the corridors of court, and eventually committed to a secret plan that Drake carried in his head rather than on any paper that could be found and read, was something of breathtaking scope. Drake would sail south, pass through the treacherous straits at the bottom of South America, enter the Pacific. That ocean he had glimpsed from a hilltop in Panama, and vowed to sail and raid the Spanish settlements along the western coast of South America. These were ports that Spain considered utterly untouchable, protected not by fortifications or garrison troops, but by geography, by the sheer impossibility, as the Spanish understood it, of any enemy vessel appearing in those waters. No English ship had ever sailed the Pacific. No English captain had ever rounded Cape Horn. The very idea was, from a Spanish perspective, essentially inconceivable. That was precisely what made it attractive. In December of 1577, Drake sailed from Plymouth with 5 ships and approximately 160 men, under the cover of a story, for the benefit of Spanish spies and anyone else who might be watching, that he was heading to Alexandria on a trading voyage. No one of any experience believed it for a moment, but the fiction gave the enterprise the deniability it needed. The crossing of the Atlantic was relatively uneventful by the standards of what was to come. It was in South American waters that the voyage first encountered genuine crisis, not from Spanish opposition, but from within. One of the senior officers on the expedition, a gentleman named Thomas Doughty, became the focal point of growing tensions between the professional sailors in the crew and the gentlemen adventurers who had signed on expecting a different kind of voyage. Accusations accumulated of insubordination, of conspiracy, of witchcraft. That last charge perhaps more revealing of the atmosphere of fear and suspicion aboard than of any actual supernatural activity. Drake convened a trial on a desolate beach near the Rio de la Plata, in the grey light of the South American winter. Doughty was found guilty. Drake had him executed. It was not a comfortable moment in the Drake story, and history has never quite settled on what to make of it. What is clear is that Drake understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had been at sea long enough to know what happens when authority fractures, that he could not afford dissent. Not where he was going, not with what he intended to do. The execution of Doughty was brutal. It was also, in Drake's calculation, necessary. And then he gathered his remaining men on that windswept beach and gave them a speech, direct, plain, and remarkable in its candor, in which he told them exactly what lay ahead and offered any man who wished to turn back the chance to do so. None of them turned back. They passed through the Strait of Magellan, the narrow, violent passage at the southern tip of South America, flanked by towering rock and driven by ferocious winds. In 16 days, it was extraordinarily fast for the era. Drake had reduced his fleet to 3 vessels by this point, and even those were battered and tested by the time they emerged into the Pacific. Then a storm struck, a storm of such sustained and terrible force that it scattered the ships, drove one back to England, and sent another with all hands to the bottom of the sea. Drake was left with a single vessel, his flagship, the Pelican, which he had quietly renamed, somewhere in the middle of all this, the Golden Hind. One ship, perhaps 80 men, and an entire ocean ahead of him. He pointed the bow northward, into waters no English keel had ever touched, toward a coastline where no one knew he was coming. The Spanish were about to be reminded that the ocean was not, in fact, their road alone. There is a particular quality to the silence that precedes something the world has never seen before. Not an empty silence, a charged one. The kind that sits in the air just before a door opens that has never been opened, before a line is crossed that has never been crossed. That is the silence that hung over the western coast of South America in the early weeks of 1579, as a single English ship moved northward through the Pacific, unhurried, its hull dark against water that no English sailor had ever sailed before. The Spanish settlements along that coastline had been built, over the preceding decades, on a foundational assumption that they were safe. Not merely defended, safe. The Pacific was their private ocean, the Strait of Magellan, through which any Atlantic vessel would have to pass to reach them, was considered by most serious navigators to be effectively impassable in any reliable, repeatable way. Only one expedition had ever transited it successfully, Magellan's own, half a century earlier, and that voyage had been so catastrophic in human cost that it had functioned less as an advertisement for the route than as a warning against it. The ports of Chile and Peru, Valparaiso, Lima, Callao, had no significant defensive walls on their ocean sides. They had no naval patrols watching the horizon for approaching sails. They had warehouses full of silver, harbors full of unarmed merchant vessels, and the absolute confidence that nothing was coming. Francis Drake was coming. He arrived at Valparaiso, the principal port of Chile, in early December of 1578, and the harbor received him with an openness that was almost painful in retrospect. A Spanish vessel in the harbor, the Capitana, saw the approaching ship and assumed without question that it was a Spanish vessel, possibly a long-awaited supply ship from Panama. The crew broke out wine. They began to celebrate. A sailor climbed the rigging and beat cheerfully on a drum in greeting. Drake's men came alongside, boarded, and it was only when the Spanish sailors looked into the faces of the men climbing over their rails, English faces, speaking English words, that the full, disorienting reality of the situation arrived. Valparaiso was taken without meaningful resistance. Drake's men found a haul of Chilean wine, gold, and a quantity of cedar planking that would prove useful for repairs. None of it spectacular by the standards of what was to come, but significant enough as an opening statement. The town itself was largely empty by the time they reached the shore, the inhabitants having fled into the interior at the first alarm. Drake did not burn the settlement. That restraint was consistent with his general approach throughout this Pacific campaign. He was not conducting a war of destruction. He was conducting a war of accumulation. There was a meaningful difference between the two, and Drake understood it precisely. He moved northward. Port after port encountered him with the same foundational unpreparedness, because the news of his presence could not travel faster than his ship, and his ship was moving quickly. The Spanish had no mechanism for warning their northern settlements, no signal fires established for this contingency, no fast naval vessels positioned to run ahead with the alarm. Drake was operating in a communications vacuum of his enemy's own making, and he exploited it with systematic thoroughness. At each stop, he gathered not only valuables but information, interrogating captured sailors with care, consulting charts taken from Spanish vessels, building in real time an increasingly detailed picture of what lay ahead. He was hunting. And the thing he was hunting had a name. The Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, Our Lady of the Conception, was known to Spanish sailors by a nickname that has a somewhat indelicate ring to modern ears but was offered with genuine affection, Cacafuego, meaning roughly, in its most printable translation, fire spitter. She was the principal treasure galleon on the Pacific route, and by the time Drake learned of her existence and her direction of travel from the crew of a captured vessel, she was somewhere ahead of him, heavy with silver. and entirely unaware that anything in the Pacific had changed. Drake pushed the Golden Hind hard. He offered an incentive to the first sailor who spotted the Cacafuego, a gold chain, and the lookouts watched the horizon with corresponding intensity. On the 1st of March 1579, off the coast of Ecuador, they found her. The capture itself was handled with the combination of speed and deception that characterized Drake's best tactical work. He approached from windward, the superior position giving him control of the engagement, and took care to disguise the Golden Hind's speed, trailing makeshift sea anchors of wine jars filled with water to slow his approach and prevent the Cacafuego from realizing, until it was too late, what kind of vessel was bearing down on her. When they were close enough, the anchors were cut. The Golden Hind surged forward. A volley was fired, damaging the Cacafuego's rigging, bringing her mizzenmast down, preventing any chance of flight. And within minutes, the two ships were alongside each other. The treasure found aboard the Cacafuego was, even by the spectacular standards of the age, extraordinary. The accounting that survives, and these things were accounted for with the detailed attention that large quantities of money tend to generate, records 80 pounds of gold, 26 tons of silver, 13 chests of silver coins, and quantities of jewels and precious stones beyond easy summary. It took Drake's crew several days to transfer the cargo from one ship to the other. The Golden Hind sat noticeably lower in the water when they were finished. The Spanish captain of the Cacafuego, Juan San Juan de Anton, was treated with scrupulous courtesy throughout. This too was consistent and deliberate. Drake understood, with the strategic intelligence that distinguished him from a simple raider, that his treatment of prisoners would have consequences. Captains who were robbed and then released, unharmed, fed and clothed and sent on their way with their personal possessions intact, would describe their experience when they reached port. Those descriptions would travel, and an enemy who was feared but not gratuitously cruel was a more complicated political problem for the Spanish crown than an outright monster would have been. Drake was not performing mercy. He was practicing it as a form of information management. He released San Juan de Anton and continued north. The question that now faced him was a profound one, and it went beyond tactics into the realm of pure strategic imagination. What did he do next? The obvious answer, the answer that simple prudence might have supplied, was to turn around, go back the way he had come, and return home through the Strait of Magellan with his extraordinary cargo. But Drake did not reach for obvious answers when better ones were available. Going back the way he had come meant sailing directly into the teeth of every Spanish ship and garrison that by now knew he was in the Pacific. The element of surprise was entirely gone. The southern route was hostile and treacherous. It was, in many respects, the most dangerous thing he could do. He considered his alternatives with that characteristic patience, that quality of unhurried deliberation that sat so incongruously alongside his reputation for boldness. He pressed further north, into the waters off California, farther north than any European vessel had reliably charted, searching for a possible passage back to the Atlantic across the top of the North American continent. This passage, which explorers of the era sometimes called the Strait of Anian, and which we now understand does not exist in any navigable form, was nevertheless a genuine object of geographical speculation at the time. Drake spent weeks probing northward along the California coast into increasingly cold water and inhospitable conditions, before concluding that if the passage existed at all, it was not going to reveal itself here, not to this ship, not now. He put in at a harbor somewhere on the California coast. The precise location has been disputed by historians for centuries, with candidates ranging from what is now Drake's Bay, just north of San Francisco, to points further up the coast, and spent several weeks careening the Golden Hind. Careening meant beaching the vessel, tilting her onto her side, and scraping the accumulated growth and damage from her hull. a necessary maintenance operation that the ship badly needed after many months at sea. While they worked, they made contact with the local indigenous population, the Coast Miwok people, who by all English accounts received the strangers with a mixture of ceremony and genuine curiosity. Drake, in the formal manner of the era, claimed the land for the English crown, naming it Nova Albion, New Britain, and erected a brass plate recording the claim. Whether that plate has ever been genuinely found remains one of the more entertaining minor controversies in Californian historical archaeology. By the time the Golden Hind was repaired and reprovisioned, Drake had made his decision about the route home, and it was characteristically audacious. He would cross the Pacific. He would sail west across the largest ocean on Earth, through waters that European navigators had only begun to understand, following the established Spanish trade route in reverse, through the East Indies and around the bottom of Africa, and come home to England from the east. It was not a small decision. It meant committing to a crossing of roughly 8,000 miles with a single ship, a reduced crew, and no guarantee of safe harbor until they reached the Portuguese trading posts in the East Indies. It meant sailing in waters that were simultaneously well-traveled by Spanish and Portuguese vessels, any of which might decide that the appropriate response to an English privateer was not courtesy, and poorly charted for someone working from captured Spanish charts and the accumulated navigational knowledge of a crew that had never been in these waters before. Drake left the California coast in the summer of 1579 and pointed the Golden Hind west. For 68 days they saw no land at all. 68 days of open ocean, of rationed water, and carefully managed provisions, of a crew that had been at sea for the better part of 2 years, holding itself together through a combination of discipline, trust in their captain, and the particular stubbornness that long voyages develop when there is simply nowhere else to go. And then, on the far side of all that blue emptiness, islands appeared. The Philippines, the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, source of nutmeg and cloves, and the fortunes that the spice trade had been generating for a century. Drake negotiated with the Sultan of Ternate, taking on provisions and establishing what may have been the first formal diplomatic contact between an English representative and a Southeast Asian ruler. He was not merely a raider now. He was, whatever he had been when he left Plymouth, something that was beginning to look, in its informal and improvisational way, like an instrument of English foreign policy. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope in June of 1580, the southernmost tip of Africa, and turned north into the Atlantic, the ocean that had, in a sense, made him. He was nearly home. Behind him, across 3 oceans, the Spanish were still trying to understand what had happened to them. There is a moment in the life of any figure who has done something genuinely unprecedented when the world must decide what to do with them. Not merely what to think, what to do, because unprecedented things create problems that existing categories cannot comfortably contain, and the people in power must choose, quickly and carefully, whether to embrace the disruption or distance themselves from it. Queen Elizabeth I of England faced exactly that problem in the autumn of 1580, when a battered but seaworthy galleon called the Golden Hind sailed quietly into Plymouth Harbor after an absence of nearly 3 years, carrying one of the most extraordinary cargoes ever to enter an English port. Drake had sent word ahead, discreetly, as he did most things, and the Queen's advisors had already begun the delicate process of calculating what his return meant, because it meant several things simultaneously, and not all of them were comfortable. The treasure aboard the Golden Hind was, by the most conservative estimates, worth somewhere in the region of £500,000, a sum that represented, approximately, the entire annual revenue of the English crown. That number alone made the question of what to do with Francis Drake considerably more interesting than it might otherwise have been. One does not quietly distance oneself from £500,000. Not if one is a monarch operating on Elizabeth's perpetually strained budget. But there was the Spanish question. There was always the Spanish question. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru, a man whose patience had been severely tested by English privateers for years, had received detailed reports of everything Drake had done in the Pacific, the raids, the Cacafuego, the systematic plundering of a coastline his empire had considered inviolable. He was furious in the measured, controlled way that genuinely dangerous men tend to be furious, not shouting, not theatrical, but cold and purposeful and entirely serious. He demanded, through the formal channels of diplomatic correspondence, that Elizabeth condemn Drake's actions, return the stolen treasure, and punish the man responsible. Elizabeth did none of these things. She did something far more interesting. She invited Francis Drake to court. The meeting between the Queen and her returning privateer has passed into the kind of historical legend where the precise details become less important than the atmosphere they collectively create. And the atmosphere was extraordinary. Elizabeth was fascinated by Drake. She had always been drawn to bold men, to people who moved through the world with conviction and capability, who did not flinch from the consequences of their own ambitions. Drake, who had grown up in modest circumstances in Devon and built himself into the most feared sailor in 3 oceans, possessed those qualities in abundance. He brought her gifts, jewels taken from Spanish vessels, exotic items gathered across 4 continents, and the breathtaking fact of what he had accomplished. She wore some of those jewels publicly, where Spanish ambassadors could see them. The diplomatic message was not subtle. The Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza, pressed his case with considerable energy. He presented formal demands for restitution. He argued, not unreasonably from his position, that what Drake had done was simple piracy, that Elizabeth's letters of marque did not extend to the Pacific, that the plundering of the Cacafuego was theft under any interpretation of international law that Spain was willing to recognize. Elizabeth listened with the expression of gracious interest that she had spent decades perfecting, and did absolutely nothing he asked. What she did instead was invite Drake aboard the Golden Hind, which had been brought around to Deptford on the Thames on the 4th of April, 1581. The occasion was a banquet, elaborate, public, theatrical, in the way that Elizabeth understood all significant political acts needed to be theatrical. Several thousand people gathered on the riverbank to watch. Foreign dignitaries were present. The Spanish ambassador was conspicuously not. Elizabeth arrived by barge, stepped aboard the ship that had circumnavigated the globe, dined with its captain, and then, at the conclusion of the meal, in full view of the assembled crowd, produced a gilded sword. She announced, with characteristic wit, that she had a commission to strike off Drake's head. She then handed the sword to a French diplomat who was present, the Marquis de Marquemont, and invited him to perform the actual ceremony. A deft piece of political choreography that made the knighthood simultaneously an English and a French act, complicating Spain's ability to protest it as purely an Anglo-Spanish provocation. Sir Francis Drake rose from the deck of the Golden Hind, a knight of the realm. The Spanish crown's reaction was precisely what one might expect. Philip II reportedly described the knighting as one of the most outrageous acts Elizabeth had ever committed, which, given the competition for that particular distinction, was saying something. The Spanish ambassador filed formal protests. European courts debated the legality and the audacity of it, and Elizabeth smiled her careful smile and noted that she found it difficult to see what precisely the fuss was about. What the knighting represented, beneath its ceremony and its diplomatic provocations, was a clarification. Elizabeth was telling Philip and the world that England did not accept the Treaty of Tordesillas, did not accept the papal division of the globe between Spain and Portugal, did not accept the premise that the oceans were anyone's private property. Drake had sailed the Pacific and come home alive and wealthy, and rather than apologizing for it, England was going to put a sword on his shoulder and call him Sir Francis. The age of English maritime ambition was not merely beginning, it was announcing itself, loudly and without apology, in the language that 16th century power understood best. Drake himself handled his new celebrity with more grace than many men might have. He had come from nothing, from a Protestant minister's modest household in Devon, from an apprenticeship on coastal trading vessels, from the brutal schoolroom of the Caribbean raids. And he had arrived at a point that no amount of imagination in his childhood could have made available to him. He bought a substantial house in Plymouth. He entered civic life, eventually becoming mayor of the city. He sat in Parliament. He married. His first wife, Mary Newman, had died during his long absence, and he subsequently married Elizabeth Sydenham, a wealthy heiress from Somerset, a woman of considerably higher social standing than the man he had been when he set out on all of this. He was, in the years between his return and his next great act of service, living proof of a particular kind of English social mobility that the sea made possible, a mobility that the land, with its rigid hierarchies and inherited titles, rarely permitted. The ocean had always been, in this sense, a democratic institution. It did not particularly care who your father was. It cared whether you could read the wind. But the quiet years did not last long, because the world was moving toward a confrontation that had been building for decades, and men like Francis Drake were too useful to leave in civic administration for long. By the mid-5080s, the relationship between England and Spain had deteriorated beyond the point where diplomacy could maintain even the fiction of peace. Philip II had seized English merchant vessels in Spanish ports. English volunteers were fighting alongside Dutch Protestant rebels against Spanish forces in the Netherlands. The tensions that Elizabeth had managed with such consummate skill for so long were becoming unmanageable, and both sides knew it. War, formal, declared, fully committed war, was approaching with the slow inevitability of a tide. In 1585, Elizabeth gave Drake a commission that made his earlier letters of marque look modest by comparison. He was to take a fleet, a real fleet, not the small expeditionary forces of his earlier career, and conduct a comprehensive campaign against Spanish interests in the Caribbean. The objective was not merely plunder, though plunder remained relevant. The objective was to demonstrate, in the most convincing terms available, that Spain's overseas empire was vulnerable, that its ports could be taken, that its defenses were insufficient, that the cost of maintaining hostility toward England was going to be higher than Philip had perhaps calculated. Drake sailed in September of 1585 with roughly 25 ships and 2,000 men. It was the largest force he had ever commanded, and the difference in scale from his earlier Caribbean expeditions was not merely quantitative. It required a different kind of leadership, less the intimate command of a small crew who knew their captain personally, more the management of a complex organization with its own internal politics and competing interests. Drake proved equal to it, though not without friction. He took the Spanish city of Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, and the oldest European settlement in the Americas, in January of 1586, holding it for ransom and systematically dismantling its fortifications when the Spanish proved unwilling to meet his price. He did the same to Cartagena, the great port on the Colombian coast, which fell to a night assault and yielded, after prolonged negotiation, a substantial but somewhat disappointing ransom. He burned St. Augustine in Florida, the first permanent European settlement in what would become the United States. On his way home, almost as an afterthought, he returned to England, having made his point with considerable emphasis. The Spanish Caribbean was not impregnable. The empire could bleed. Philip II, watching all of this from Madrid with that cold and patient fury, reached his own conclusion. Negotiation was finished. Diplomacy was finished. Privateers and letters of marque and the careful maintenance of undeclared hostility were finished. He would build an armada, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, and he would send it to end the problem of England once and for all. Francis Drake, for his part, did not wait for it to arrive. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with trumpets or grand declarations. It arrives quietly, in the form of a decision made in full knowledge of what it will cost. A decision to move toward the thing that everyone else is moving away from. Francis Drake possessed this quality in abundance, and nowhere did he demonstrate it more clearly than in the spring of 1587, when the rest of Europe was watching the Spanish war machine assembling itself on the Atlantic coast and wondering, with varying degrees of dread, what came next. Drake did not wonder. He had a proposal. The armada that Philip II was constructing was not a secret. It could not be. The sheer scale of it made secrecy impossible. Across the harbors of Spain and Portugal, hundreds of vessels were being requisitioned, fitted, armed, and provisioned. Thousands of soldiers were being assembled. Barrels of food and powder and shot were being stockpiled in quantities that spoke to an enterprise of extraordinary ambition. The English intelligence network and Elizabeth's principal secretary, Francis Walsingham, maintained one of the finest intelligence networks in Europe, was feeding a steady stream of information back to London about the Armada's progress. The picture that emerged was alarming. Philip was not building a raiding fleet. He was building an invasion force. Drake's proposal, delivered to the Queen and her council with the directness that was always his characteristic mode of address, was simple in its outline and staggering in its implication. Rather than wait for the Armada to come to England, rather than spend the coming months in anxious preparation, reinforcing harbors and marshalling defenses, and hoping that the fleet, when it came, could be met on acceptable terms, Drake proposed to go to Spain, to sail directly into the ports where the Armada was being assembled, to find it before it was ready, and to hurt it so badly that it could not sail on schedule. The proposal was debated with the energy that genuinely dangerous ideas tend to generate. There were members of the council who found it reckless to the point of irresponsibility, who argued that sending Drake and a fleet into Spanish waters was more likely to provoke the Armada to sail sooner than to delay it, that the risk of losing the ships was too great, that England needed those vessels at home. Elizabeth herself wavered, as she often did when decisions carried irreversible consequences. She authorized the expedition. She then sent orders countermanding it after Drake had already sailed. Those orders arriving in Plymouth to find the harbor empty, the fleet already at sea, the door already closed behind him. Whether Drake received the countermanding orders and chose to interpret the situation as one in which the logistics of communication had simply overtaken events, or whether he was genuinely at sea before they arrived, is one of those pleasing historical ambiguities that says something true about the man regardless of which version is accurate. He was not the kind of commander who waited for permission when he believed he was right. He arrived off the coast of Portugal with a fleet of roughly 23 vessels in late April of 1587, and paused briefly at the Portuguese coast to gather intelligence about conditions in the harbor of Cadiz, the great Spanish port city on the Atlantic coast of Andalusia, and one of the principal assembly points for the Armada's growing strength. What his scouts reported was encouraging in the way that things are encouraging when the risk of them is so obvious, that encouragement requires a certain temperamental optimism to register at all. The harbor of Cadiz was full. Dozens of vessels, in various stages of preparation for the Armada, sat at anchor or alongside the quays, some armed, some not, some half-loaded with the provisions and equipment that an invasion fleet required. Drake called his captains together and presented the situation plainly. He intended to sail directly into the harbor, not to blockade it from outside, not to hover at a cautious distance and assess. Into it, through the harbor entrance, past whatever defensive guns were positioned there, and among the Spanish ships before the port's defenders could organize a coherent response. His captains absorbed this information with the varied reactions that such proposals tend to produce, some with enthusiasm, some with the careful blankness of men who have learned that enthusiasm and terror can occupy the same face. On the afternoon of the 29th of April, 1587, the English fleet sailed into the harbor of Cadiz. The defenders were not entirely unprepared. Drake's approach had been observed, and galleys, the low, fast, oar-driven vessels that Spanish harbor defenses relied upon, came out to contest the entrance. They were met with broadside fire that the Golden Hind and the other heavy English galleons could deliver with a weight and accuracy that the lighter galleys could not match. The galleys fell back. The English fleet pushed through. What followed was roughly 36 hours of methodical, organized destruction. Drake's crews moved through the anchored Spanish vessels with the purposeful efficiency of men who had thought carefully about what they were doing and intended to do it thoroughly. Ships that could be taken and sailed away were taken. Drake seized several vessels of real value. Ships that could not be conveniently removed were burned. The Great Marquesa, a vessel of substantial tonnage that had been serving as a supply ship for the Armada, was set alight and burned to the waterline. Smaller craft were destroyed in numbers. Provisions, the barrels of food and water and salt fish that a fleet required to function, were seized or destroyed. Barrels of seasoned barrel staves, critically important for the construction of watertight casks, were burned in quantities whose significance would only become apparent later. Drake held the harbor for a day and a half before withdrawing, not because Spanish resistance had driven him out, but because he had accomplished what he came to accomplish and the tactical situation no longer warranted remaining. He had destroyed or seized somewhere between 24 and 37 vessels, depending on which contemporary account one consults. He had disrupted the supply chain of the Armada in ways that went beyond the immediate visible damage. And he had done it in the principal naval harbor of the most powerful empire on earth, in broad daylight, and sailed away. He was not finished. He spent the following weeks ranging along the Portuguese and Spanish coasts, intercepting supply vessels, disrupting communications, preventing the resupply of Spanish harbors. His fleet captured the great Portuguese carrack, São Felipe off the Azores, a vessel inbound from the East Indies, whose cargo of spices, silk, gold, and extraordinarily detailed commercial intelligence about Portuguese trade routes in Asia proved so valuable that it has been credited with helping to inspire the founding of the East India Company. Even Drake's opportunistic captures, in other words, had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. When he finally returned to England, he described what he had done with characteristic understatement in a letter to the council, using a phrase that has followed him through history ever since. He had, he wrote, singed the King of Spain's beard. It was not merely a colorful metaphor. It was a precise description of the strategic intent. He had not defeated the Armada. That was not the objective, and could not have been the objective with the forces available to him. He had humiliated its preparations. He had delayed its sailing by at least a year. Philip's original schedule had intended the Armada to depart in 1587, and the damage done at Cadiz, combined with the ongoing disruption of supply lines, pushed that departure back to 1588. He had demonstrated, again, that Spain could be reached, that its ports were accessible to English force, that the gap between Spanish power and English audacity was narrower than the Spanish liked to believe. And he had bought England time to prepare, time to build, time to argue in the councils of state and the conversations of admirals about how best to meet the storm that everyone now understood was coming, delayed perhaps but not deterred. The Armada sailed in the summer of 1588, 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men, soldiers and sailors combined, the largest naval force assembled in European history to that point. Its intention to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands, cross the Channel, land on English soil, and end, in Philip's considered and patient judgment, the Protestant experiment that Elizabeth represented. Drake was appointed Vice Admiral of the English fleet, serving under Lord Howard of Effingham as Lord High Admiral. It was a position that reflected both his extraordinary reputation and the social realities of an era in which a Devon tanner's grandson, however brilliant and however knighted, could not be placed above a nobleman of ancient family in the formal hierarchy of command. Howard and Drake worked well together. Howard was wise enough to know what Drake knew, and Drake was experienced enough to know that the arrangement, whatever its symbolic awkwardness, was workable. The story of the Armada's defeat is one of the great set pieces of English history, told and retold until the outlines are so familiar that they risk losing their texture. Drake's specific role within it included the celebrated incident at Plymouth, where, according to tradition that may contain more truth than the skeptics allow, he was playing bowls on the Hoe when the Armada was sighted, and finished the game before going to deal with the Spanish. Whether or not the bowls game happened precisely as described, the spirit of it is accurate. Drake, by 1588, had been in dangerous situations so consistently and for so long that urgency had been replaced, in his manner, by a kind of methodical calm. He commanded the English fireships, unmanned vessels packed with combustibles and set alight, that were driven into the anchored Armada at Gravelines in the dark hours of the night of the 7th of August, scattering the Spanish formation in panic, forcing the fleet out of the anchorage it had chosen and into waters where the weather and the English guns could find it. The battles that followed in the southern North Sea were grinding and brutal and, ultimately, decisive. The Armada, battered and disorganized, unable to rendezvous with Parma's army, unable to return south through the Channel against the prevailing winds, was driven north around Scotland and west around Ireland, losing ships to storm and rock all the way. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain so magnificently, fewer than half returned. England had not been invaded. The Protestant settlement had survived. Elizabeth gave a speech at Tilbury that history has never forgotten. And Francis Drake, Vice Admiral of the fleet that had faced down the greatest armada ever assembled, sailed back into harbour. He was 48 years old. He had been at sea in one form or another for the better part of 35 years. He had circumnavigated the globe, raided 3 oceans, singed a king's beard, and helped defeat an invasion. He was not finished. He would never quite be finished. But the world that came after the Armada was a different world. And Drake's place in it, and his final chapter, would carry a quieter and more complicated kind of weight. There is a particular melancholy that attaches itself to greatness in its later years. Not because greatness diminishes exactly, but because the world around it changes, and what was once perfectly fitted to its moment can find itself, gradually and without any single dramatic turning point, slightly out of alignment with the times. Francis Drake did not become lesser after the Armada, but the Armada, in defeating Spain's greatest effort, also subtly altered the conditions that had made Drake's particular kind of brilliance so essential. England had survived its existential moment, the desperate, improvisational, privateer's energy that Drake embodied. That quality of moving fast and striking hard and asking permission later was now competing with something more institutional, more bureaucratic, more cautious. He was not done, but the remaining years of his life would be marked by a persistent and widening gap between what he attempted and what he achieved, between the legend that preceded him wherever he went and the complicated, costly reality of operations conducted at scale, against an enemy that had learned, slowly and painfully, to be less surprised by him. The first significant disappointment came in 1589, barely a year after the Armada's defeat. Drake was given command, alongside the army commander Sir John Norreys, of what has come to be called the English Armada or the Counter Armada, a massive retaliatory expedition designed to follow up the defeat of the Spanish fleet with a comprehensive campaign against Spain's Atlantic coast. The objectives were ambitious to the point of contradiction: destroy the remnants of the Spanish Armada fleet in its home ports, place a claimant friendly to England on the Portuguese throne, and seize the Azores as a permanent English base in the Atlantic. It was, in retrospect, asking one expedition to accomplish what three separate, well-resourced campaigns might have struggled to achieve. The fleet that sailed was large, somewhere in the region of 150 ships and 18,000 men, the largest force England had ever dispatched on an overseas expedition. The scale of it was also, in certain ways, its problem. Drake had made his name commanding small forces with concentrated purpose, striking where defenses were thin and speed was everything. Now he was managing an enterprise of governmental complexity, answerable to investors, to politicians, to the competing agendas of two co-commanders whose visions for the expedition did not always align. The privateer's freedom of movement was gone. In its place was the weight of expectation and the friction of institution. The campaign went wrong in stages, each stage adding its increment of disappointment to the cumulative total. The attack on Coruña, where surviving Armada vessels were sheltering, achieved partial success, but failed to destroy the fleet as intended. The assault on Lisbon, the most ambitious objective of all, collapsed without ever properly beginning. As the Portuguese population failed to rise in support of the English-backed pretender as anticipated, and the army found itself outside the city walls without the siege artillery it needed to make a serious attempt on them. Disease, always the great equalizer of 16th century military campaigns, began moving through the English ranks with the efficiency it invariably demonstrated when large numbers of men were crowded together in warm climates without adequate provisions. The Azores were never reached. Drake returned to England having spent enormous resources and lost thousands of men to illness and combat, with results that bore no resemblance to the ambitions with which the expedition had departed. The investors were furious. The Queen, who had contributed royal funds to the venture, was furious in that particular way of hers that combined genuine anger with theatrical disappointment and left the recipient in no doubt about the depth of her displeasure. Drake was summoned to account for himself. The accounting was not comfortable. He was not imprisoned, not formally censured, not stripped of his knighthood or his reputation, but he was, for the next 5 years, kept at a distance from significant naval command. Elizabeth, who had always understood Drake's value precisely, also understood the political arithmetic of failure. She could not be seen to reward it. And so he retreated, with whatever private feelings the retreat occasioned, to Plymouth, to his house, to his civic duties, to the practical concerns of local governance, water supply, harbour maintenance, the unglamorous but genuinely useful work of a man of standing in his community. He served again as Mayor of Plymouth. He sat in Parliament. He oversaw the construction of a water liaison, a system of leats and channels that brought fresh water from Dartmoor into Plymouth, a project of real and lasting benefit to the city that tends to get mentioned briefly in Drake biographies before the narrative hurries back to the sea battles. But it mattered. It was the work of a man who understood that greatness was not only expressed in audacious voyages, that the same intelligence and determination that had taken him around the world could be applied to the problem of making sure a Devon port city had clean water. The leat he built, in various forms, continued to serve Plymouth for 3 centuries. He was also, in these quieter years, a man processing the ordinary weight of a life fully lived. He was in his 50s now, an age that in the 16th century carried different implications than it does today, an age at which the accumulated physical cost of decades at sea began to make its presence felt. He had been wounded, exposed to the diseases of 4 continents, pushed through privations that would have broken constitutions less fundamentally sturdy than his. He was still vigorous, still present, still recognizably himself. But time was doing what it does, and the man who had climbed a tree in Panama to look at the Pacific was not the same man who now managed municipal water infrastructure in Devon, even if something essential in him remained continuous between the two. He missed the sea. That much seems clear from every account of these years. Not romantically, not in the soft focus way that men sometimes miss their youth, but practically, specifically, the way a craftsman misses his tools when they are taken away. The sea was the medium in which Drake thought most clearly and acted most effectively. Everything else, however competently managed, was a lesser register of himself. In 1595, the call came again. One final time. The expedition that Drake and his old companion John Hawkins were commissioned to lead in that year was, in conception, a return to the Caribbean strategy that had defined Drake's earlier career, a comprehensive campaign against Spanish interests in the West Indies, with the particular objective of capturing the treasure port of Nombre de Dios and crossing the Isthmus of Panama to intercept the silver route, as Drake had attempted and nearly accomplished 23 years earlier. The wheel, in a sense, was coming full circle. But the world of 5095 was not the world of 5072. The Spanish had spent the intervening decades learning from their repeated encounters with Drake and with English privateers generally. Their Caribbean defenses were no longer built on the assumption of invulnerability that Drake had found so useful in his earlier campaigns. The ports were better fortified. The garrisons were better organized. The intelligence networks were more alert. Spain had been hurt enough times that it had finally, thoroughly, done the work of trying to ensure it would not be hurt again in the same ways. There was also the matter of the two commanders themselves. Drake and Hawkins were both in their mid-50s, old men by the standards of their era, carrying the weight of long careers and the particular physical vulnerabilities that long careers at sea produce. The dynamic energy of Drake's earlier expeditions had operated on the metabolism of a younger man, on the speed of decision-making that comes most naturally when the body is still in full alliance with the mind's ambitions. That alliance, in 1595, was more negotiated than absolute. The expedition ran into difficulty almost immediately. An attempt on the Canary Islands failed. Spanish intelligence, another sign of how thoroughly the strategic environment had changed, had learned of the English fleet's destination and dispatched fast vessels to warn the Caribbean ports of its coming. The element of surprise, which Drake had always wielded as his most fundamental weapon, was gone before the fleet reached American waters. Puerto Rico, which the English attacked in an attempt to seize a treasure shipment sheltering in its harbor, was defended with unexpected ferocity. During one of the engagements off the Puerto Rican coast, a cannonball struck the stern of the vessel where Drake was dining with his officers. The shot killed several men and sent splinters of wood and metal across the cabin. Drake was unharmed physically, but those around him noticed something in his manner afterward, a quietness, a weight that had not quite been there before. John Hawkins, his old kinsman and mentor in the ways of the sea, died aboard his vessel in the harbor of Puerto Rico on the 12th of November, 1595. He had been unwell for weeks, the voyage having taken a toll that his body could no longer absorb without consequence. Drake attended to the necessary details of command that Hawkins's death required and pressed on, because pressing on was what Drake did, what he had always done when alternatives presented themselves. He sailed to Nombre de Dios, the port he had raided as a young man, and took it, a success of sorts, but a hollow one, the port largely evacuated, and offering little of the treasure the expedition required. He sent a force inland toward Panama, along the same route he had walked with Cimarron guides in another lifetime, and that force was met by Spanish defenders who had prepared extensively for exactly this possibility, fighting in terrain they knew and the English did not, and the inland advance was turned back. He withdrew to the ships. The dysentery that had been moving quietly through the fleet for weeks now reached Drake himself. He was sick in the way that men of his age and his accumulated physical history become sick, When tropical disease finds them, quickly, seriously, without the reserves of resilience that had seen him through earlier illnesses, he continued to function, continued to command, continued to make decisions and issue orders, refusing with characteristic stubbornness to acknowledge what the people around him were beginning to understand. On the 28th of January, 1596, in the early hours of the morning, anchored off the coast of Portobello on the Panamanian coast. Almost within sight of waters he had first sailed as a young man burning with purpose and fury after the betrayal at San Juan de Ulua. Francis Drake died. He was somewhere between 55 and 56 years old. He had been at sea, in spirit if not always in body, for the entirety of his conscious life. His men dressed him in his armor. They sealed him in a lead coffin, a soldier's and a sailor's burial, practical and permanent. And then they carried him to the rail of his ship and committed him to the sea that had made him. The coffin went down in the warm Caribbean water, settling toward the same ocean floor that had received so many of the ships he had burned, and the storms he had survived, and the ordinary dead of an extraordinary life. 2 ships were sunk alongside him to mark the place. The spot has never been precisely located. Divers and historians have searched those waters at intervals for 4 centuries, and Drake remains where his men left him, somewhere in the blue quiet off Portobello, keeping his final secret with the same composure he brought to all the others. What he left behind was not merely a legend, though the legend was considerable. He left behind a transformed understanding of what England was and what it might become. When Drake was born, England was a secondary maritime power, capable, ambitious, but operating in the long shadow of Spain and Portugal, nations that had got to the ocean a generation earlier and built empires of staggering wealth on the advantage. When Drake died, England had circumnavigated the globe, raided the Pacific, helped defeat the greatest armada ever assembled, and planted, however tentatively, the first seeds of the commercial and naval culture that would eventually produce the British Empire. He was not the only cause of that transformation. History is never so simple as a single man, but he was its most vivid embodiment, its most compelling human argument, proof offered repeatedly and at extraordinary personal risk that the ocean was open to those with the courage to sail it, that power was not fixed, that empires could be challenged, that a boy from Devon with nothing but intelligence and nerve, and an absolute refusal to accept the world's existing arrangements as permanent, could leave his name on the water and on the wind and on the long memory of the sea. The Spanish called him a pirate, the English called him a hero. History, with the long patience that it brings to these questions, has called him both, and found that both, in their way, are true, and that the truth of him is larger than either category can fully contain. He was Francis Drake. He sailed where no one thought to follow, and the sea, in the end, took him home.